Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Ruben Lamdany on International Monetary Fund reform. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, your host, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week we speak to a notable expert in some aspect of global governance here from the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And this week I'm very pleased to welcome Ruben Lamdany, who's a very distinguished international public servant, the Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund, and also formerly Director of the World Bank Institute and Senior Manager of the Evaluation Office at the World Bank, as well as a World Bank lead economist. And Ruben, you're the author, lead author, I should say, of this publication, Governance of the IMF and Evaluation, completed in 2008, which recommended a series of changes to governance of the International Monetary Fund to enhance its credibility and its effectiveness in assisting the world economy. And of course, it's very timely because we're at a pivotal point in the development of the International Monetary Fund's international role. So for the benefit of our audience, let's step back a bit and let me ask you just a simple question. What's the background to this particular study? Who proposed it? Who initiated it? What issues led to the belief that governance at the IMF had to be studied seriously with an eye toward reform?
Thank you very much. We initiated this study early in 2007. The idea to prepare this study came from Tom Burns, who is now the director of CIGI. He had had a long and successful career in many different positions at the IMF, representing the government of Canada, being director of evaluation and other positions. And he came to the conclusion that reforming its governance was key to address what were probably the two main questions about the fund at that time. Is the fund still relevant, and to what extent is a legitimate organization? So in that context, we launched this study. It's hard to think back to 2007, when the fund was not lending to anyone, when the world looked as if it was going to be, early 2007, in a period of long prosperity. And people were saying, well, why do we need the IMF? We looked at these issues and decided to assess the governance of the IMF from four dimensions. We looked at its effectiveness, its efficiency, the degree of accountability that there was in the system, and the capacity of the system to provide voice to the members. We thought that these were the four dimensions that are behind giving legitimacy to the organization and therefore to generate relevance. We looked at the structure of the organization, at the incentives that people faced, and how it worked in practice. And the big picture is that we concluded that the fund was very effective in dealing with crisis, but that its effectiveness was significantly weaker in times in which there was no crisis and where monies didn't need to be passed through the fund. Those were times in which surveillance, perhaps the main mandate of the fund, which is to go and tell countries what are their problems and how the international community sees those problems on behalf of the international community, and tell the international community about the problems that a specific country has. Mm-hmm. This is the main reason for which the fund was created, to be able to coordinate this advice as well as to coordinate policies and help countries when they get in trouble. So for this surveillance function, the effectiveness of the governance of the fund was not very high.
So when you talk about effectiveness, you're talking about effectiveness of governance, not effectiveness of the fund in the global economy. Separate issue.
We're talking about the effectiveness of the governance of the fund. To what extent the systems that the fund has are able to, in a fast enough fashion, reach decisions and then being able to implement them.
Mm-hmm. And there was a feeling that there was a history of delay, a history of inadequate response or confused response, a sort of dissatisfaction with how the fund had performed in earlier periods, earlier events.
Well, there was clearly a dissatisfaction, not with the speed, and perhaps not with the quality of the governance, but with the quality of the decisions that the fund had reached. And many people said that the quality of those decisions were highly influenced by the governance. That in particular there was an issue of lack of voice, that some voices, minority voices, which in hindsight may have been more right than not, had not been heard.
Right.
There was a view that there was no accountability, that there was no consequence to recommending the wrong policies. And in the effectiveness is that some voices were being heard faster than others.
I see. Well, let's talk about that again in a moment. I'll be back with Ruben Lamdany to talk about the International Monetary Fund. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Ruben, let's talk a little bit about the structure and function of the fund. As our viewers probably are aware, the fund was created after the Second World War to assist severe liquidity, balance of payments problems, and it did play a very important role in many places of the world, helping countries get on their fiscal feet, as it were. Now, the structure of the fund hadn't dramatically changed apart from a growth in membership in most of the post-war period. Was there a sense that the current structure and function of the fund had was anachronistic, was no longer appropriate for dealing with the specific kinds of issues that were confronting the global economy? Or was the problem that the structure of the fund no longer reflected, say, power realities in the world as a whole? Combination of the two, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's a combination of these two issues. As you mentioned, the fund was created about 60 years ago, and until the recent crisis emerged, there was a sense that perhaps it's not needed anymore. And today we all agree that the fund is more needed than ever, or at least more needed than in the recent past. But it is clear that in order to be effective, it needs the trust of the membership. And the trust goes through its governance structures. So the fund is a cooperative, or was created as a cooperative. Initially of 20-some countries, it grew to be about 40-some countries, and then grew very slowly to 187 members now. As you said, the basic structure of the fund did not change very much, and a lot of things became obsolete. So what is this structure of the governance of the fund? There is a board of governors that meets for a few minutes every year, one representative per country. They have all the powers, but they have delegated them to a board of directors, which is resident in Washington, D.C., has 24 members. Some of these members are appointed or elected by a single country. Others represent large constituencies. The most extreme case is the African chairs. There are 2 African chairs that represent over 20 countries. In addition to that, there is an there is a management which is formed by the managing director and 3 deputy managing directors, and about 2,800 staff members. A little bit on the side of that, there is the International Monetary and Financial Committee that meets twice a year, which is composed of the ministers of 24 countries. For some countries, it's always the same country. For others, they somewhat rotate. And they're supposed to be guidance, but they're not, a part of the executive thing. Now, initially, the board of directors was truly an executive board. It's referred to as the executive board, and it was truly an executive board. It had a few members representing the few member countries, and participated in the day-to-day business of the fund. As the fund grew, and it became less of a cooperative where everybody was more or less the same, to more of a bank, where some members are most often borrowing and others most often lending, the nature of the relationship of the board and the actual working of the fund changed. So the board now has 24 members. It's very hard to have a serious discussion and decision making on 24 people. They meet 3 times a week, which means that they're constantly busy participating in meetings. Mm-hmm. It's very hard for them to have serious thinking. So they move from being actually a true executive board to being more of a deliberative board. But because they have executive powers, they are unable to provide oversight as a supervisory board will be. So it's a hybrid which is in a very hard place. Mm-hmm. Now, in times of crisis, this board, receiving instructions from their member countries, can very fast make decisions. But going back to 2006, early 2007, the world needed guidance on what is wrong. And as we know, something was very wrong. But this body was not able to brainstorm. It's not an organization that can brainstorm very easily, 24 members. Mm-hmm. Each of them has 4 or 5 people sitting behind them, representing sometimes other countries. It is not amenable to that type of activity. So the structure of the fund and the function of the fund began moving in a direction that was putting it in a corner.
And meanwhile, authority within the fund was basically falling in the hands of a relatively small number of countries.
That,
or at least that was the perception.
That's true. That's by construction.
Right.
As opposed to the boards of the United Nations, where it's one country, one vote. Voting in the IMF is weighted by this, more or less by the size of the economy. Right. But as emerging markets were growing very fast, their share in the ownership of the fund wasn't going hand in hand. Every time that there was a decision on changing and giving a greater share to those countries, that was done, incrementally in drops. That changed in the last couple of years, perhaps because of the crisis. And now there is a shift of a little over 5% that's going to take place, I believe, next year. But before it was shifts of 1%, 2%. In fact, we're going to be seeing a big change in the power structure as China is going to become the number 3 shareholder.
Right.
So that's probably the biggest change in many years.
In that respect, the IMF is at least more nimble than the UN, which hasn't managed to update its power structure since the Second World War. We'll be back to talk further with Ruben Lamdany. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, Ruben, now we have a sense of the problems. What were some of the proposed solutions? What changes did you actually recommend in this report?
Well, we suggested 4 major reforms, and then a list of over 15 other more minor changes, some of which are big, but minor relative to the big ones. The four major changes is a need to clarify the role and responsibilities of the governing bodies of the fund. For example, today there is a managing director who supposedly manages the fund, and there is an executive board which supposedly manages the fund. So the limit between their responsibilities is unclear, which means that then you cannot hold anyone accountable, because if everybody is responsible, then nobody is responsible.
And does that lead to standoff occasionally between the director and the manager?
No, in fact, the managing director runs the board, and except for very extreme circumstances, either because he has consulted with the main shareholders or because of the power of the position, the managing director carries the day. Right. Either way, either because he consulted or because it has a decision needs to be made, and if there is a stable equilibrium that doesn't lead anywhere in the board, then the managing director decides. So one is to clarify the roles and responsibilities. And our recommendation is that and this is the second recommendation, is that the board should shift a little bit away from being an executive board, leaving only a few executive decisions there, and becoming more an supervisory board, focused on oversight, on holding management accountable, on deciding on strategic issues, and on making the decisions that create precedents. So that's our third recommendation, is to involve ministers in a more active way. That can be done either by strengthening the role of this consultative body, which is the IMFC, or by creating a council of ministers that would meet periodically, maybe twice a year, like the IMFC meets now, to make the big decisions for the fund. Right now, this has in some way been superseded by the G20. The G20 process in some ways is doing what we propose should be done by this council, except that the G20 is also outside of the fund, or more outside of the fund than the IMFC, and that doesn't have legal power.
And is not as broadly representative.
That's the weakness of it. If it would have been a council of ministers or strengthening the IMFC, it would have been representative of the 187 members. Right now it's only 20 members. Mm-hmm. It has greater representation than the G7 or the G8. Right. But it's still 20 is less than 187, and there are large numbers of interests in the world that are not represented there. Mm-hmm. Our final big recommendation is to create an accountability framework for the institution and for management with a high degree of transparency, so that people know that the board will not be involved every day, but once a year, twice a year, we'll be able to come to the managing director and say, look, you're doing a good job or you're not doing a good job, and please make the necessary changes. We also had a series of smaller recommendations. With respect to the big ones, I think we have influenced the discussions. Our work was followed. The managing director called for the creation of what was called the Eminent Persons Group, chaired by Trevor Manuel, who at the time was the Minister of Finance of South Africa, and with representation from eminent people from all over the world. And they basically endorse our recommendations on the reform of the governance of the IMF. And there has been some movement in the direction of these four high-level recommendations. There has been more movement on some other recommendations. Some of them are very timely now. We had recommendations on how to make the selection of the managing director and the deputies more transparent and more merit-based. We had recommendations on how to define in a more clear way what are the terms of reference of the executive directors at the board. We had recommendations on how to strengthen the committee system of the fund, and in particular, recommendations on the oversight of ethical and conflict of interest issues, how to strengthen the audit function. In all these areas, there has been some movement, obviously not as much movement as we would have wanted, but there's been significant movement, and in some areas, this is well known. I mean, for example, in the contract of the managing director, it was written what type of code of conduct it will be subjected to. Recently, there has been an update of the code of conduct that applies to the staff of the fund, and that also followed our recommendations. We had concerns about how the audit function was being discharged, and that was greatly strengthened following our recommendations. So all in all, I think that usually evaluation takes a long time.
It's quite a comprehensive package.
Yes. So
we'll be back again in just a minute with Ruben Lamdany. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. You've already touched, Ruben, on the question of implementation, and I'd like to ask you a bit more about that. But before I do, I'm curious to know, for most of these reforms you proposed, where did they fall on the spectrum of specificity? In other words, were they more sort of declarations of principles of changes that ought to be made, or were they quite detailed in terms of recommending specific ways of implementing particular kinds of changes? Or were they sort of in a range?
This is a very good and difficult question, and a question that we face in every one of our evaluations. By the way, we prepare only 1 or 2 evaluations per year, or 1 to 3 evaluations per year. And in each of them, we have to struggle with the question, are we trying to second-guess management and help with our thoughts, or high-level recommendations that then they can implement? And we usually end up with a hybrid. We have high-level recommendations, and then we say, for example, this is one way of implementing it. But the truth is that we bring to the table 2 strengths: independence and hindsight, but not greater knowledge of what are the problems that the day-to-day management of the fund brings. The fund has, over 1,000 of the best economists and minds in the world, so they would find a better solution. But both hindsight and independence are a very powerful tool. So in this case, these recommendations fall again in this hybrid. Mm-hmm. We say, for example, greater involvement at the ministerial level, and then we say, well, for example, there are 2 ways. One is to activate the Council of Ministers contemplated in the Articles of Agreement, but never activated so far, or strengthening the IMFC process. Today we also know about the G20, so perhaps at the end there will be some way to integrate other countries into having some consultation with the G20. There are other ways, but so we left it at a high level of abstraction and then a few examples. We have that in most of our evaluations.
And was there much in the way of resistance, or did the members essentially buy into your package of recommendations and then start turning their attention to implementation?
There was wide support among the membership for the need to clarify roles, to give greater involvement to the ministers, and with some questions on the issue of greater accountability. in the board of directors, there were more questions as you get closer to what it touches your own work. But some people had questions. Are we recommending that the fund not have anymore a resident board? Because we say specifically there should be a resident board, but people were saying, well, but if you give so much power to others and you make us only a supervisory board, and then some countries. The greatest resistance came from two areas on two different issues. One is the resistance of everybody to change when it's unclear what is. So that was a nebula.
General uneasiness.
Yes, general uneasiness. The other one is from a large group of emerging and developing countries that were concerned about creating a council of ministers before there is a reshuffle of the shares of the fund.
Right.
We're saying, that's fine. Let's create a council of ministers once the ownership represents the real powers on the ground. So this is, I think, continues to be the struggle. The beauty of these higher level recommendations is that they don't become obsolete so fast.
Right.
So they're still, today in the discussions about the governance of the fund, our findings are still there on the table.
And as a rough estimate, how far down the road is the fund now in terms of implementation of the full package of recommendations?
I wouldn't be able to make that estimation.
But still more work to do, but some definite progress.
There is a lot of work to do because it's a never-ending agenda.
Right.
Some of our recommendations have been implemented, and now they need another generation of implementation. Right. They need further change.
And is this changing how the fund operates, and is it changing its relevance? Is it making the fund a more significant player in global governance?
I believe so, but things have also changed. There has been a crisis, and now the fund has become more relevant because of the crisis. Right. But definitely today the discussions about the selection of a managing director on a merit-based is on the table. We are not the only ones that put it on the table. This has been a discussion alone, but we contributed to this. As I mentioned to you, the issue of a code of conduct, we put it on the table, others too, it is there. I mean, there are some things that are very extreme. I mean, we suggested there should be hotline and a whistleblower system in place. And when we first asked for comments from people on our draft, they said, this we actually can implement very fast, and it was implemented immediately. So there are some issues that were done immediately, others that have been faced, and others on which the political process has not yet yielded results. Mm-hmm. But there is a new generation of needed reforms now, which if we did another study, we would have seen now. But it's a never-ending process. I don't know that I can say it is 2% or 98%, but progress has been occurring in circumstances that were not static. I mean, the crisis was both a catalyst for change in some areas, and in others, people say, well, that's very important, but now we have even more important stuff. So played both roles. Some things moved faster, other things were left for when the situation will be calmer.
Well, we always play catch up with events. We always try to engineer an international body for yesterday's problem when we're actually facing tomorrow's.
Yep.
Well, a heroic task, and I really appreciate your coming in and helping us understand better the nature of the changes happening at the IMF. And please come back and join us again and give us another perspective on the further implementation of the recommendations.
Thank you very much.
You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube, where you can find our complete collection of Inside the Issues episodes. Who initiated it? What issues led to the belief that governance at the IMF had to be studied seriously with an eye toward reform?
Thank you very much. We initiated this study early in 2007. The idea to prepare this study came from Tom Burns, who is now the director of CIGI. He had had a long and successful career in many different positions at the IMF, representing the government of Canada, being director of evaluation and other positions. And he came to the conclusion that reforming its governance was key to address what were probably the two main questions about the fund at that time.
The Deputy Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the International Monetary Fund, and also formerly Director of the World Bank Institute, and Senior Manager of the Evaluation Office at the World Bank, as well as a World Bank lead economist. And Ruben, you're the author, lead author, I should say, of this publication, Governance of the IMF and Evaluation, completed in 2008, which recommended a series of changes to governance of the International Monetary Fund to enhance its credibility and its effectiveness in assisting the world economy. And of course, it's very timely because we're at a pivotal point in the development of the International Monetary Fund's international role. So for the benefit of our audience, let's step back a bit and let me ask you just a simple question. What's the background to this particular study? Who proposed it?
Is the fund still relevant, and to what extent is a legitimate organization? So in that context, we launched this study. It's hard to think back to 2007, when the fund was not lending to anyone, when the world looked as if it was going to be, early 2007, in a period of long prosperity. And people were saying, well, why do we need the IMF? We looked at these issues and decided to assess the governance of the IMF from 4 dimensions. We looked at its effectiveness, its efficiency, the degree of accountability that there was in the system, and the capacity of the system to provide voice to the members. We thought that
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Ruben Lamdany on international monetary fund reform. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, your host, the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week we speak to a notable expert in some aspect of global governance here from the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And this week I'm very pleased to welcome Ruben Lamdany, who's a very distinguished international public servant.
These were the 4 dimensions that are behind giving legitimacy to the organization and therefore to generate relevance. We looked at the structure of the organization, at the incentives that people faced, and how it worked in practice. And the big picture is that we concluded that the fund was very effective in dealing with crisis, but that its effectiveness was significantly weaker in times in which there was no crisis and where monies didn't need to be passed through the fund. Those were times in which surveillance, perhaps